Thank you so much for having me. Am I loud enough?
Yes.
Okay. My first job was a civilian instructor with the armed forces, and I taught open water rescue, which means I can be in the harbor in a gale and you can hear me 100 meters away. It's never been a problem. So thanks for the invite to come. When David and I spoke about coming today, we thought maybe to share a couple of things. Share with you the state of homelessness and the crisis it is right now, and a little bit about how we got here, because that's going to help us figure out how do we go out the other side. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's coming, what's being done, and then maybe talk a little bit about the home sharing movement, which is something that you're all very interested in and where it can go. I think the first place to start, and you've probably heard some of these numbers, so I won't go into them really deeply, but in July, we did what's called a sleeping rough survey. That's a count of the people who are sleeping in tents, and there are 178. Since July, street navigators estimate that that number has now climbed to over 200. There's also 1,000 people on what we call the by name list. And to help make sure everybody knows the difference, sleeping rough is when you're in a tent, but you can be homeless sleeping in other places. You might be on a friend's couch. You might be in somebody's car. You might be in the hospital temporarily and have lost housing when you're coming out. So the by name list is something that when you work with a street navigator, they can add your name to, saying, I'm homeless and need help. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're stuck in a tent somewhere. So it's just important to know the difference in the numbers. And I think it's really important to realize the crisis part of this. In 2018, there were 18 people sleeping rough. And it doubled, more than doubled, between November 2022 and that number in July. So less than 8 months, it doubled from 85 to 178, and now it's over 200. So if we did a graph, you would see that graph come along and then spike, because we are in this rapidly increasing number of people who are homeless. At one point, there were 10 or more people a week joining the by name list. So we really are in a crisis. But it's important to know it's because it's relatively recent. Now, one of the contributing factors is that we haven't built a lot of public housing. Quite frankly, we haven't built public housing in our province in 30 years. And there's lots of blame to go around for that. And it doesn't matter what political stripe you wear. We've had NDP, PC, and Liberal governments, and not one of them has built public housing. And people like to point at different political parties. There's none of that. This is a community issue. We didn't do it. The caveat that I'll put on that is in 2017, I was in a discussion with people about closing shelter beds because there weren't enough people to use them. So when we look back and go, yes, we did not invest in public housing, and it was coming. We knew something was coming. But put yourself back in 2017, 2016, we were talking about closing shelter beds because there wasn't that much need. So we do have to realize it's rapid, it's growing enormously, it's growing so quickly. And it's important, too, to think about who's out there. Everybody wants, they want one solution to the whole problem, which won't work, and two, that the people who are experiencing homelessness are the same, which is also not true. We have people, for example, my mother just moved, she's 85. My dad died 2 years ago, the house got too big for her, and she made the decision 5 or 6 months ago that I'm ready to leave the house. And those things take time for you to work through. And so she's fortunate enough that she and Dad bought that house in like the 50s, paid it off, sold it in this real estate market for a rather gruesome sum of money from what I think of what it was worth growing up in that house. But either way, it'll fund her to live the rest of her days in the Berkeley at $5,000 a month. She's really, really fortunate. The same weekend I moved her in, one of my colleagues put a 68-year-old person in a tent for the first time in their lives. And that's not an isolated story. I've got a list of names of people who look like us, or some of us at least, who are in the no hair, gray hair type environment. Can you imagine, for the first time in your life, worked all your life, paid your way, saved money for your retirement so you'd be okay, and then suddenly, in what is a huge real estate boom, have just been priced out of every possible place you can be? That's the crisis. And we should know other things too. 63% of the people who are sleeping rough outside would voluntarily share that they're suffering mental health challenges. Perhaps the most staggering statistic is over a quarter, 27%, are former children or youth in care of the province. So if you take that number and work it backwards, about 0.002% of the province are former youth or children in care. It's an overrepresentation of over 10,000 times. So a lot of our homeless are children and youth who went through the most difficult childhood most of us can imagine and are now struggling with homelessness. And we can give you lots of other information, but the people who are homeless are not homogeneous. It's not the same. People ask, who is becoming homeless right now? We'll tell you the fastest growing group are people who simply have not enough money to afford an apartment. If you've been down to Grand Parade in Halifax, and there is the fact that there are people in Grand Parade, for some folks, has been the largest source of hate mail that municipal staff and councillors have gotten in their careers. And yet some of those people work full-time. They have full-time jobs. They get up in the morning, go out of their tent, find a public washroom to wash, and then go to work all day. And they simply do not have enough money to be able to afford rent. Average rent, one bedroom, about $1,800 a month. Plus, you imagine how difficult that is. We know other groups that are showing up. Seniors, I already mentioned. People who are gender diverse. We even have families that show up. So it's a huge crisis. And we've talked to the people who are out there. What people will tell you who are sleeping in a tent, they want food, water, protection from the elements, a place to go to the bathroom, and somewhere to sleep where they're not worried they're going to be robbed or attacked. They are highly stigmatized. Every day, people who are homeless in our community get spit on. People set fire to them in their tents while they're in them. That happens in our community. Violence is a part of everyday life. So, not a great thing at all, and we should talk a little bit about the future. CMHC does a study every quarter on housing and rents and so on in a couple of dozen cities. Halifax is one of them. This spring, they released their report. We got it in June, and it says that the rental pressure in Halifax will continue for the foreseeable future. They cannot identify when it will slow down. It means rents will keep going up, prices will keep going up. We know from the census data that there's over 30,000 households in what we call core housing need. In other words, they spend more than 30% of their income on housing, which is what CMHC says a third of your income should go to housing. We also know that there are households spending 50, 60, 70, 80, and 90% of their income on housing. The provincial rent cap is going to change on January 1st. It's going to allow a 5% rent increase. So you take $1,800 a month, let's make it $2,000 to make the math easy, 5% rent increase, that will force some people into homelessness. And before we go too far down on the evil of that, remember that that 5% will not cover the increasing costs that landlords are facing. And so you will see especially small landlords with affordable units are selling them off. And they're selling them off because they cannot afford to keep them, because their insurance, for example, went up 40%. So we are actually at this moment losing affordable housing stock. Not gaining. We are losing affordable housing stock. You probably read that we had 22,000 people move into HRM last year. We built less than 6,000 homes. That includes apartments. We have students living in tents going to school. We have students living in Truro in New Glasgow, because that is the closest they can get to a university in Halifax, or in one case, for a group of 4 I know living there, they're going to Cape Breton University. And they commute on Monday, they sleep in their car for 2 or 3 nights, and then commute back home the last day. That's the kind of pressure. People who know me know, well, I believe in bringing refugees to our community. I believe a host of the benefits that comes. My concern is this: there's no place for them to live. If you followed the last group that came to Toronto, they were set up in tents on the steps and front yard of the refugee clinic because there was no place for them to go. And we do not have enough plans to build enough what we call deeply affordable housing. So lots of confusion about the terms, but affordable housing is 30% below market rent. $1,800, that means about $1,250, which is still more than you can afford on minimum wage. Deeply affordable, which we're going to talk about, is housing that is 1/3 of your income regardless of what it is. And to put some of that in perspective, if you're on income assistance, you don't even get $600 a month for rent. So there's challenges. Our expectation, based on that curve I mentioned, is that the number of people sleeping outside will more than double by the time we hit spring. So for every tent you see, there will be 2 next year, no matter what we do. That is already coming. Every tent you see, there will be 2. Maybe in different places, but that's what's coming, and we can't stop that wave. Maybe we can do more. I do tell people about the great lie in all of this. If we keep building, we will solve the problem. Alex Halaf, who is the president of Bonk, one of the big developers, came to a luncheon held by the Chamber of Commerce this year, and he opened up essentially his stuff, and he said, it costs me $300,000 an apartment to build an apartment building. And he said some of them are spending $400,000. He said maybe you can build it really cheap and really badly and get it at $250,000. Somebody also shared that. But $300,000 a door is pretty much guaranteed a very basic unit. You take $300,000, you amortize it over the commercial lending rate to simply finance a new building. The financing cost is $1,485 a month. He can't build it and rent it for less than the $1,800, $2,000 with the way interest rates are and the cost of building. The commercial developer cannot get us out of this, because yes, if we built and built and built, and we increased the vacancy rate, rent would drop a little bit, but it can't drop below the amount of cost to build it. So we need to build or create deeply affordable housing. And the private sector won't do it. So the question becomes, with all of that information in front of us, what's happening right now? So you've heard about a couple of things I want to touch on, and then I want to sort of talk a little bit about sort of some of the shared housing ideas that you're looking at. And then happy to answer questions. And I want to all do it in time before David gives me the hook and yanks me off the stage. He tried to give me a time limit and everybody laughed. I'm not good with that. But let's talk about a couple of things that you're hearing about. You've probably heard about pallet shelters. So first off, a pallet shelter is not built with pallets. People like to think it is, but it's not. Pallet shelter is actually a trademark name by a company called Pallet Shelter. And they build these structures. They come on a pallet. Prefab pieces. Think of it like a gigantic IKEA project, which means don't let me put it together because there'll be spare bits left over. But they come, they sit on flat ground. They are insulated to -40. So these places are used in Boston. They have power, they have heat, they have a bed, they have a desk, they have a chair, they have some open space, and they have some storage. You probably, if you've been watching the news, heard the term pallet village, because we don't put these by themselves. They get put together in groups of 15 to 20. Now these are being all purchased by the province. They are buying 200 of them. 100 will be in the boundaries of HRM, and the other 100 will go around other parts of the province. So you put these together in villages. Each village has a service provider who provides wraparound services. They also get a washroom facility, a dryer facility, a common room area that all come as modular units. They are approximately 12 weeks away, which means they'll get here somewhere in January, early February. They take about 2 hours each to set up, and pallet will come up and set them all up. They're fenced, they've got 24-hour care, so the province is doing all of that. The municipality for those is going to provide a coordinator for the project. We're going to do snow clearing, garbage collection, all of those typical things.
Where do they come from?
A pallet shelter has a number of warehouses. They're primarily they're a company, their headquarters in the U.S.
Yes, I think it's Oregon or Washington
Yeah.
State. Now, that's a long way to travel.
Yep.
Must be expensive to ship them that far.
You'd have to ask the province. I don't know what the costs are for them. They did announce the total cost in a press release they did. And I think it was $9 million, but that was with everything, I think, included.
Nobody in Nova Scotia can build them?
Again, you'd have to ask the province because they're the ones who's buying them. But I will tell you, nobody brings the expertise that pallet does, because it's not as much about building them as it's knowing how to do it right. So that's one thing that's coming. The second thing you've probably heard about is tiny homes. So tiny homes are a type of housing stock that's missing in our continuum. So I mentioned earlier, there's no one solution. This is one of the real hard things that people are trying to get to as well. This is the solution. It isn't. People aren't the same. And so we need a variety of options. Some of you will remember, if you go back into that 16, 17 era, we had 123 rooming houses in HRM. We now have 3. Now, some people don't like rooming houses, but for some people, they were the right solution. There's a housing worker named Megan in the community, and she will tell you this story of when she had access to a rooming house. She brought this young man in and showed him the room. And she'll tell you this was kind of scary for a couple of minutes. She's in the room, he's in the room. He closes the door and locks it. So she's a little nervous, but she's known the client for a while. He leans back against the door, falls to the floor and starts to cry. He said it is the first time in his living memory that he was able to lock a door where he was living. It was, as he said, this is all I can manage. So this idea that some people, everybody should get into market housing and so on, some people will never get there, and that's okay. So we need a variety of options. Tiny homes is one of those. Probably the biggest difference between a tiny home and a pallet shelter is the tiny home is plumbed. In other words, it has its own bathroom, has its own water and things like that. The pallet shelter is a temporary option where those are on site, but they're not in your own space. I have 10 minutes. Thank you, sir. See, they even have somebody in the front to watch. Not only did David put a clock up so I could watch it like I asked him, he assigned somebody to do that. Yeah, he's tough, but I'm not good at those things. But I did promise I would try. So tiny homes, so currently there is an encampment site in Sackville on what is called the Correctional Ball Field. There was a former correctional facility out there. That ball field was a municipal property. We declared it surplus several years ago, and so we are going to, through some mechanism, give it to the province so they can do the tiny homes community. That will also have a not-for-profit service provider. And each of these service providers will also, not only will we create them in different locations, we'll also think about different purposes. You imagine that you're an intravenous drug user, and next to you is somebody who's desperately trying to go straight and sober. We're going to create some of these options where your neighbors are sober. This is a place where if you want to be where you don't see it around you, that's great. We'll create others where, you know what, we'll build a harm reduction model. If that's something you need to do right now, that's okay. We'll make sure you're in a place where your neighbors understand. We may create a place that's for youth, for a variety of other things. But so those are two big things. 100 pallet shelters, 52 tiny homes. Tiny homes hopefully will be ready, 30 of them will be ready in the summer, the rest ready, the other 22 in the fall. You've probably heard that we've opened one of the municipal campgrounds for 12 RVs that we knew we had some people. If you have a place for your RV, that's great, but we did know of 9 people who were going to be kicked out of where they were, so we created a space for them. You've probably heard just announced as a winter shelter. So it's an indoor shelter. It's going to be at St. Paul's Church on Windmill Road in Dartmouth. It's going to have a standing, what we call a standing area, which isn't about standing, but what it means is that bed is assigned to you. So it becomes your place. You can stay there. You'll have a cubby for storage and a variety of things. And then there'll be another section for people who may not want to stay the whole winter there. And then hopefully we'll extend that and keep that going. That will start with 50 people and will expand up. People ask a lot about pets. The winter shelter, which I just mentioned, is going to take pets. It will be the first time in history that a shelter in HRM has been able to take pets. The other advantage of the pallet shelters and tiny homes is people will be able to have pets there. So there is lots of things coming. If we go back to the very beginning about the by name list, 1,014 people registered to be homeless, and that's not the final number. We do know there are people who are homeless who have said, I don't want to be on that list. David and I were talking about somebody when we were getting ready to go who hates all the forms, doesn't like to give their personal information. That's fair. So we do have people who are not on the by name list. So if you add up the numbers I've just read to you, 100 pallet shelters, 52 tiny homes, maybe 50, maybe even 100 in the winter shelter. We have 200 sleeping rough right now. That number is going to double. We still don't have enough yet. So we need to continue to look for options. One of those options that you're talking about today is home sharing. Now, people like to say home sharing is new. And Jonathan and I had a really good conversation about this. Home sharing began in about the year 100. Actually, probably happened before the year 0. But we know, for example, in the year 100, that guilds, merchant guilds, took in people as apprentices and so on and billeted them. Some of us, again, in the no hair, gray hair club, probably remember in universities had student housing departments who arranged billeting in the community for students. When Cape Breton University was going through their big crisis a couple of years ago, that was our first suggestion to them when they asked us. Let's go back to billeting. It works. And it's not a new idea. It's been around since probably before year 0. But it's gone out of favor in some cases, and there's lots of questions. So the municipality has done some things. We have created secondary suites and made some bylaw changes to make those things easier. We continue to do that. And there have been a lot of secondary suites approved. Now, a lot of them, not all, a lot of them are getting used to house your kids. I don't know about you, but in my family, I have a 23-year-old nephew. I remember being 18 going, get me the F out of here. I was done living with my parents. Well, what we're discovering is 22, 25, 30 can't get in a place to live yet. So a lot of secondary suites are being used for them. That's not a bad thing, because that frees up other housing options. But probably one of the most heartwarming stories we've seen recently is an older gentleman, 73, living in the Grand Parade. He did a story on global television about the fact that he got priced out of his apartment. He didn't do anything wrong. He didn't smash the windows. He didn't break it. He didn't hold wild parties with 20-year-olds smoking drugs. He just got priced out of his apartment. And 2 days later, this very nice other older gentleman walks down, sits in front of his tent, talks to him for 20 minutes, said, "You want to come live in my spare room?" And the guy said, "Sure." Off he went. And the two of them are now renovating another spare room in this guy's house so they can do it again. These things are out there impossible. So, big government projects, that's going to take time. Big bills are going to take time. But there are things that we can do right now. Some of these tiny homes, pallet shelter solutions, RV park things, are things we can do right now. So are home sharing ideas. And one of the questions for you is, how do we make it possible, popular, and practical for people to do it? Again, I'm pretty sure most people in the room, and again, I'm sure we've all got the nephew that we wouldn't do this with, but most of us quite happy to take the niece and the nephew in, if that was an option. But there's a lot of other people. We know the fastest growing number. People who simply don't have enough money. That's it. They don't have any of these horrible images we have, perhaps, of homeless. They just need income. So there was some customer service research published out of the Harvard Business Review a few years ago. And it said the number one factor in repeat business, in ongoing business, wasn't customer service or anything like that. It was, how easy is it to do business with you? If you make it difficult for me to do business with you, I'm not. And it got me starting to think about, and I use it in my work, and I'm encouraging you to think about it today. How do we as a community make home sharing an easy option for people? David, I'm sure, has shared with you latest information on the number of empty bedrooms that are laying around in our municipality. But it's not just empty bedrooms. There's empty garages, there's loft above garages, there's all sorts of places. Pretty sure there's a whole bunch of good people who are sitting around thinking, how can I help? But they don't know how. And whether it's home sharing, whether it's something else, one of the things that I think as a municipality we need to do is find ways to make it easy for people to help. So how do we make it easy for people to home share? How do we help somebody who goes, what are the rules? And where do I find out about them? And where do I find out about them in language that I can understand, with a diagram that doesn't confuse me, and where I can call or email one time and get a phone call from somebody who will help me walk through it. I think there are some people who should not be home share sharers. I think we have to think about unknown people going into places, and is everybody safe? So I think we need to make sure that, we match people well. If you don't know somebody, but you say, I'll do it as long as, the person's compatible. So maybe you don't want somebody who smokes. If it's in your home, that's a reasonable request. Maybe I want somebody who's got this or that. Maybe the person who wants to come in is going to have those pieces. How do we make it easy for the person who's prepared to open a space to somebody who needs it? How do we make it easy for them to do it? How do we make it easy for the person to accept? And how do we make it easy to address any issues that come up? You've probably heard about lots of these home projects where everybody has to get a lease. Leasing is the basis of so many different things, and it makes things complicated. There is this great program in Maine. And in Maine, a housing worker will go up to you and say, do you need a place to live? And if you say yes, they will walk you into an apartment and say, how about here? That's as complicated as it gets. They have figured out this answer to how do we make it simple for people who want to help. And right now, for many people, it's pretty complicated or it's pretty daunting. So I'm going to leave you with that today. Happy to answer questions, but sort of that's what's happening, that's what's coming, that's what we're in the middle of, and that is where I think the concept of home sharing could be huge. Again, we've got students living in tents trying to go to university. My friends know I've said this. I want a t-shirt that says, what's wrong with us? Because there's a whole lot of stuff out there that we should just be able to do better. So David, that's me. I will shut up now.